Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Joe Patrick on Football. My name is Joe Patrick. For 92.9 The Game, I cover the Atlanta Falcons, and the team was back at training camp after their second preseason game on Monday, and it was a bit of a sloppy day, in my opinion. Maybe you just give credit to the defense as having a good day, but to me, yesterday, I don't know if anybody is not familiar with the weather in Atlanta yesterday. It was quite warm on top of the fact that Raheem Morris, with the kind of official training camp having been concluded, the players having gone back to live at home, fans no longer in attendance, practice was moved back an hour into a hotter portion of the day. And I thought that shone on the players who just looked a little bit I don't know if lethargic is the right word. They're just struggling, I think, in the heat to adapt to it, and it's probably good training for them to get ready to play where they'll never have to play in conditions that difficult. And obviously, that's part of training camp. That's something that happens anyways. But yesterday, I think, was a little bit of a shock to the system for some of the players, especially offensively. You could just see them even from the beginning of practice, kind of struggling a little bit. So that's worth noting. And, there's obviously been a lot of consternation in Falcons fandom about, about the preseason, the fact that the starters are not playing games and what that means. And I think that when I sent that tweet out yesterday on Monday about them being sloppy, there was some concern of that, the fact that they have not been playing the preseason games is leading to some of this sloppiness. And I think that is not the reading that I certainly intended for it to be. I think that it was mostly down to the weather, coming off of a weekend break. Sometimes you're just not, you're not practicing at the best possible level. And I would also say, I think anybody who's played football, I think probably understands this a little more, not to be like, like that guy about it, but sometimes you have better practices and sometimes you don't. And it's not really associated with a whole lot of anything other than just, individuals being, sharper on a given day. So I wouldn't read into it anything more than that. But I do want to say on the preseason front, a lot the reason why Raheem Morris does not want to play the starters is for injury reasons. And I think that when you look at the injury list that the Falcons are dealing with right now, I think it speaks to this being the wiser approach at this point in time versus putting more guys under stress on another day, to go out and play in some of these games. I'm just looking at some of the practice DNPs from yesterday. And again, potentially some of the reasons why it was maybe a little bit more disjointed. You didn't have Ray McLeod or Kaderil Hodge available to practice yesterday. That's on top of already missing Darnell Mooney. So that's three of your top receivers down. We saw Dylan Drummond taking first team reps in that F spot. Casey Washington obviously filling in for Darnell Mooney still, and Drake London playing the Z with David Sills also getting work in there. So, there was just some new players filtering into that starting 11 that I think made for some discohesion. But then on top of Ray and Hodge missing, you were also missing guys like Khalid Kareem, who was still out with his groin injury that he suffered on the last day of the joint practices, as well as Jalen Walker, who also suffered a groin injury that day. Sounds like they suffered similar injuries, although Jalen Walker was on the field and dressed out yesterday, from what I can recall, but was not like a full participant in anything. Clark Phillips also missed yesterday again, continuing to miss time with his rib injury that he suffered a couple weeks ago. That's not going to help him. You did have some players who were on the field, but maybe not participating in full. Kobe Bryant being one of them. I actually didn't notice him doing much of anything in team sessions, but he had been missing with a hamstring, I believe it was. So that's good. But if you'll notice, a lot of these injuries, it's just like a lot of soft tissue injuries, which is, I think, a bit of a concern at this point in time. It's not ideally what you want to see. And again, I think speaks to the fact that these guys are working hard. Like, these guys are pushing their bodies. And, again, I think because they're out of sight, out of mind when they're practicing, for a lot of people, you just kind of, you don't associate that with like getting good work in, getting good reps. But, and maybe it's just me personally, as someone who, has to drive an hour to Flowery Branch, and it's a full work day whenever they are practicing. And so it feels like a full work day for me, but I'm also witnessing a full work day for these players who are out there absolutely grinding on the practice field. And those are very high quality reps. And the players, especially who know that they're not playing on Fridays in preseason, know that those reps are the ones that count and mean something, so they're putting full effort into them. We're not done with some of the injury situations. DeMarco Hellams and Billy Bowman were both practicing with the team yesterday, but they were both wearing non-contact pennies. And Jamal Agnew was back out on the field. He did some punt return, but interesting to me that he's not factoring in on offense at all, despite the fact, especially that yesterday you're missing 3 receivers, and you would think that a player like Agnew would be fitting into one of those roles. Likely for me, like I think the F role would be a nice fit for him, but he seems to be a specialist only, and that's again why I am a little bit doubtful that he makes the roster at this point. I feel like I kind of stand out in that regard. I think a lot of people are chalking him in as kind of a pretty much if he's healthy, he's going to be on the roster, and I'm just not so certain. We'll see. I could be completely wrong. We'll see. Cuts happen a week from when I'm recording this today on Tuesday, so time will tell. But I think what we're likely to see is, again, the Falcons are only practicing in pads twice this week. Yesterday on Monday, again on Wednesday. Then they'll be off for most of next week. I think they'll get a practice in late in the week, and then they'll come back for that game week prep. But I think that what this week and next week are going to, I don't want to say be geared towards recovery, because they're obviously still out there working hard when they're practicing, but they're obviously, just by virtue of the practice schedule, they are lightening the load on these guys in terms of the amount that they're going to be out there. And, again, we'll see. We'll see if they're actually kind of in the best position possible, the best physical shape possible when they go into that very important week 1 game against the Tampa Bay Bucks at home, which I know we're all very much looking forward to seeing the star players of this team take the field for the first time, especially when we're seeing around the league players like Joe Burrow playing, despite the fact that he's running for his life behind his second team offensive line, which I think is crazy. But we are seeing some starting quarterbacks play, and I know that it's painful when you're seeing some of these other stars around the league play on national television. You see the highlights, you see the clips on social media, and Falcons fans just are not afforded that right now. You just have to wait. You just have to wait until you get some of those clips for the regular season. And I think if I'm to psychoanalyze a lot of Falcons fans and myself, like I've said it myself, my stance on preseason is I want to see the starters play preseason football selfishly because I just like football and I want to see these guys out there. I want to see Michael Penix throw to Drake London when they're wearing their Falcons uniforms at Mercedes-Benz Stadium where they're going to be doing it. Like who wouldn't want to see that? You kind of have to be crazy, but obviously the coaching staff has a different, point of view and how they want to do it strategically. And I do respect that. I think that it is a respectable position. I kind of, while I had some downtime this morning, tweeted out like kind of tongue in cheek, but it is serious that it's hard to defend that position of resting your starters because it just does feel like a beta, I jokingly low T kind of position, to say like, oh no, we're gonna rest. It's just not a galvanizing position, you want to see like the confidence of throwing your guys out there and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, a lot of that's more like narrative driven and not or not even narrative driven, like emotionally driven, I think, rather than the real kind of facts on the ground, which is, the state of a player's groin or hamstring or whatever it might be, and why those players might need to be rested. And I would also say that with regards to Penix and wanting to get him out there, obviously, I think it makes total sense for people to want to see him in preseason, considering the fact that he has such little NFL experience, having only played the 3 games last year. But if it's me, and I think even a lot of Falcons fans would agree, there's no way in hell you're putting Michael Penix out there behind any backup offensive lineman, especially when you don't have Storm Norton, who's your primary swing tackle, who's also missing. I forgot to mention him on the injury report. But, and especially given what we've seen from this team's backup offensive line, you don't want to put any of those guys out there to protect Michael Penix in a preseason game when there's really no reward in it. There's only risk. So, you have to be willing to start all those starting offensive linemen, which is, a stressor on them as well. So anyway, I know it's not a popular position, but it is what the Falcons are doing. So we just have to live with it. There were also some interesting moves that were made, or maybe not so interesting, but notable moves, I guess we could say. The team signed quarterback Ben DiNucci and waived Emory Jones. Now, a lot of people will look at a player being waived after he just kind of suffers a concussion or he's in concussion protocol. Certainly looked like a concussion on Friday night. And it's like, it's not a good feeling. It feels like, feels bad, man. But, listen, he receives an injury settlement for it. They knew he wasn't going to make the team. Like, that's one of the reasons why you make this move is purely just transactional. I don't think that Emory Jones is necessarily done with the Falcons or, being a practice squad quarterback in the NFL, because I think he has some utility in that role with so many mobile quarterbacks around the league. I think that Emory Jones kind of profiles as a perfect scout team quarterback to that extent. And that's why the Falcons signed him last year. So would not be surprised to see him back on the Falcons practice squad at some point after the season. But in this case, if he's not going to be able to play Friday, you might as well waive him, get a new quarterback in who can help you get through this last preseason finale, and then just go from there. That quarterback will be Ben DiNucci. He's kind of bounced around the NFL as well. Seems to be a bit of a personality. I saw he's got like 20K Twitter followers, and maybe has a role in that, like the trendy hats with the upside down logos or the upside down lettering with the teams. Seems to be a character. He announced his own signing on Twitter kind of dramatically, which Raheem Morris kind of joked he's going to yell at him for leaking when they go into the quarterback room. But Ben DiNucci will be the quarterback that is with the team. That, again, just helps them see the clock wind down. I'm sure he'll be handing the ball off quite a bit to some of these backup backs like Elijah Dotson and Nate Carter and all these guys vying for reps. The team also reportedly signed Edge Rodney Perkins. I believe the team, this has been reported yesterday. I don't know if it was official if they announced it, but I know that they were waiting for a medical to clear. Okay, yeah. So the Falcons did announce that they did sign Ronnie Perkins. So that came through yesterday. Interesting player. He's a 3rd-round pick formerly out of Oklahoma. So some potential there. We'll see. I don't think that he's a player when you're signed this late in camp who's necessarily going to have great odds at making the practice squad, but I think it's one of those things where it gives the Falcons a little bit more time to evaluate the player, just to scout him a little bit more. And if they do want to add him to the practice squad at some point after, during the season, that's something they could do. Or, who knows? Maybe he could make the practice squad straight out of camp. Obviously not going to be making the 53-man roster, we should say. And the corresponding move there is they cut DJ Chark. Chark, obviously a notable, NFL veteran who's actually has made a Pro Bowl in his career, had a 1,000-yard receiving year in 2019, I believe it was, but ultimately just never broke through in Falcons camp. So not surprising there. And then the other notable move, I believe we talked about this a little bit when we did the roster projection show, but CJ Henderson had his first full padded practice with the team on Monday. Obviously a high draft pick, being a 1st-round pick that was drafted ahead of AJ Terrell in that same draft. AJ Terrell mentioned that he basically grew up around Henderson, having gone to camps and things like that. So was very familiar with him, happy to see him in. Don't know if they would necessarily consider them friends, but definitely acquaintances from the past. So some good stuff there. Getting into practice, like I said off the top, it was a little bit sloppy in my opinion. Just some, especially from Penix, I would say, just some misplaced passes, some passes that probably should have been completed that weren't, some deep shots that we've seen him complete that weren't, although it's not necessarily a high percentage pass. But it just wasn't the most kind of seamless practice I've seen him have. But those things tend to happen. Natron Brooks had a nice interception off of Kirk Cousins. I think it's notable that it was off of Kirk Cousins and not Michael Penix, meaning that Natron Brooks was playing with the ones at that point. I think Natron Brooks is very well on his way to making this team's 53-man roster. Certainly seems like he has the trust of the coaching staff to some degree and just continues to make plays. I mean, the guy's a playmaker, and sometimes he gets beat, and he's not the biggest guy. He doesn't have the measurables that you love, but he has the tenacity and the dog in him that you love. And I think that when you look at Jeff Ulbrich and what this team wants to be defensively, that's the kind of character that they want on the defense. So I would say that even before the interception, he was in good stead to make the roster, as we said on the roster show that aired yesterday. But definitely a good day to back that up on Monday. Both the kickers were perfect on Monday as well, Lenny Craig and Younghoe Koo. I asked Raheem Morris before the practice about whether the kicking competition was over, basically, whether Koo had won it at that point. And he didn't want to go so far as to say that the competition is ever won, which is some coach speak. Koo certainly has not lost the position. Something I didn't know that I think is worth pointing out. Taryn Walk mentioned this on Twitter yesterday. I also kind of retweeted it with a thought of my own, but um, Lenny Craig, the team needs to keep him on the 53-man roster in order to then make him an IPP. From my understanding, again, this is according to Taryn's research, some clarity she said she got, which changes some things. Like that would be another roster spot that we have to account for on the 53-man roster, which basically means the roster that I made yesterday is inaccurate, and that you would have to remove some other player from that roster in order to carry Lenny Craig, or they can let him clear waivers. That would be the other option. Maybe the more likely option actually is that he is waived. He then goes through the waiver process. No team claims him. Then the Falcons sign him as their IPP. Thinking about it, it makes sense from like a players association perspective that this would be the case, because otherwise it's like something I had mentioned before. Like, why wouldn't every team in the league go grab like an Australian punter or, whatever, some kicker from former soccer player from Europe, stash him as a backup. And essentially, if they're doing that, they could just never let that guy see the light of day until they wanted to, and then put that guy in. It seems like a position that the player wouldn't really have a lot of agency in. Granted, they would have agreed to that contract and that deal, but it makes more sense for the player for every team to have the opportunity to sign these players before then they are designated as the free on the practice squad types of players. So that makes it a little dangerous. It sounds scary to expose Craig to waivers. And I think certainly if that happens, he very well could get snapped up by an NFL team. Having said that, I think it's worth mentioning that if an NFL team were to claim Craig, they would be making Craig their starting kicker. And personally, I don't think that he's shown the accuracy at this point for a team to really rely on. In fact, I think that if that happens, he might get cut at some point, and the Falcons could then reclaim him anyway. But I mean, he's got a huge leg, and it's really exciting for the future. A lot of potential there, but we've seen him. He missed one in the preseason game. Seen him miss several during training camp, and Koo is not missed. So I think it's worth keeping that in context. So with that out of the way, I did want to touch on one more thing that I found was interesting, and then we're going to get out of here. It's going to be a little bit shorter of a show today, but we were talking to Nate Ollie last week about this attack style front, and it's something that we've talked about on the show. It's exciting, how it's going to fit the players. The players have less to think about to the point where Dorlus has even said one of the catchphrases in that defensive line room is, if you think you stink, you're just kind of going guns blazing into a gap, trying to get into the backfield and penetrate. And that is what they're trying to do. But there's more to it. There's more reason for the madness other than just the madness itself, just creating chaos in and of itself. There's actually a specific reason tactically as to why teams started going toward an attack style front. And Ollie says that it traces back to, at least from his recollection, Jim Washburn, an old football coach who I believe he's still coaching somewhere. What's he doing? He is, last time he was last with the Browns in 2023. So maybe he has retired since then. But he was the team's, he was the Titans defensive line coach in like the early 2000s all the way up to like 2011, I think, or something like that. And if you like that's the time period where the Colts were absolutely dominant with their offense, obviously having Peyton Manning, but it was on the ground that allowed Peyton Manning to be so explosive and so prolific through the air, because they had that stretch run game that was just absolutely killing teams, with Edgerrin James as their lead back from 2000 to 2005. And, the Titans were apparently like one of the first ones to really create a problem for Tennessee. And they were the first ones to utilize this kind of attack style front. And the attack style front, by penetrating and getting upfield, it really, really muddles the outside zone game. And it's particularly interesting considering the Falcons are an outside zone team. So I wonder if this is giving them good scout team looks, by the way, in terms of going up against this style, where they're having to fight against this. But the whole point of a stretch play or an outside zone is, every offensive lineman is taking a step to the right or the left and going that way and just blocking whoever is essentially in that zone. And the point is that the running back is then meant to read how the blocks are forming and how defenders are fighting against those blocks to the point to a similar way where you would say like a quarterback makes it a defensive back, they make it so they can't be right, like they can only defend one zone, they can only defend one receiver, and you basically scheme up things so that they cannot the defensive back cannot make the right decision in coverage. And it's kind of similar in the stretch game where it's like the running backs job is to make the defensive lineman never be right and always to kind of put his offensive lineman in the best position possible and to ride those offensive linemen. And what the attack style front does is it disregards the blocks. So it just gets into the backfield, which totally disrupts the process that running back is meant to go through, which is to kind of read it. Previously, the way defensive linemen would punch, grab the steering wheel, so to speak, being that chest plate of the offensive lineman, and then read the block. And that's why the stretch game was so effective, because you just had a bunch of defensive linemen in that position, and the running back could then read where the holes are. Now they're all just getting upfield, and you can see if you go through some of the tape, it does create problems, and especially I would say maybe even more with a lot of the split zone action that we're seeing teams really start to utilize. So interesting. I love like the history of how some of these defensive schemes come into being and how they're counteracted. I'm sure that there are teams that can do some things to counteract the attack style fronts. I don't know if that means more just gap run type runs, like more duo and things like that against the Falcons. But we'll see. It'll be interesting. And it's worth noting, the Titans defensive line during that period of time in the early 2000s was marked by some really good players. Kevin Carter on the end, Albert Hainsworth as a defensive tackle was obviously a powerhouse for that team. Javon Curse had a lot of success before he left. So, there was a lot of success when the tactile front first was devised to stopping this outside zone. And but obviously it's more than just the outside zone. I mean, there's a lot that happens or there's reasons for it to be effective in the pass rush and things like that. So just thought you guys would find that interesting. Gonna get out of here. Team's back on the practice field on Wednesday. We'll have another recap from that practice for you guys on Joe Patrick on Football. So make sure you keep it locked. You can also follow me at JAPatrick200 if you don't already. I'm obviously tweeting a lot about the Falcons and thoughts and updates from practice. So you can follow me there. You can follow the show at 929 The Game's YouTube channel, where you can watch us. If you're watching us and you want to listen to us on podcast, just search Joe Patrick on Football wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.